My name is Mirat Mobouk. I'm the director of the Egypt and Horn of Africa program at the Middle East Institute. And this morning we were talking about climate justice, or possibly the lack of it. Climate change has wreaked havoc on the world. This year was a particularly terrible one. And one of the questions appears to be not just is it being appropriately tackled, but how do countries that are poorer, how do countries that are still developing, how are they managing to tackle it? It's also no secret that many of these countries are the least responsible for climate change, but they're also the least responsible, they're also the least capable of being able to tackle it due to a lack of finance or a lack of experience. So we have excellent panelists this morning that are joining us to be able to maybe take a deeper look at this. And we're going to we have with us Ms. Ayat Slimane, who is the Regional Director for Sustainable Development at the World Bank for Eastern and Southern Africa. Ms. Hajar Khamishi, who is the former president and co-founder of the Mediterranean Youth Network for Climate, and Dr. Mohammed Mahmoud, who is the Director for Climate and Water at the Middle East Institute. Their bios are all online. Please take a look at them. We're very, very lucky to have them. Just to let everyone know, we are live. We are on record. We will be having a moderated discussion. Please feel free to send questions as you like onto the chat. They'll come to me. If I can work them into the discussion, I will. But generally speaking, the last 20 minutes or so are dedicated to Q&A after the moderated discussion, but please do feel free to send your questions as you want. Okay, thank you. So we are going to kick off with a question to Mohammed Mahmoud. Mohammed, thank you for joining us this morning. My first question is, are there specific groups, are there specific countries that are more susceptible to climate change, and why?
Thanks, Mirat. Maybe let me answer this question sort of in a tiered way. I think number one, from a sort of natural, almost physical aspect, there are certain countries that I think are currently in a position that are more vulnerable to climate change and will expect more vulnerability as certain impacts of climate change accelerate into the future. And from a sort of geophysical natural perspective, these characteristics that are shared include, number one, coastal communities, not just island nations. Certainly those are, if we look in terms of coastal communities, will probably be the most vulnerable. But nations that share a coastline, and certainly in areas that are adjacent to larger water bodies. And the reason why is certainly we're seeing some of that implications now, but will accelerate into the future is due to sea level rise. With the warming of the oceans, expansion of waters into the coastal areas, that is going to cause some intrusion, not just in terms of loss of land, encroachment of water into land, affecting areas on the coast, whether they're urban, agricultural, industrial. But then even for nations that certainly some of the coastal communities we think of in the Middle East have groundwater that's adjacent to the sea. And so you have a risk of things like saltwater intrusion now causing not necessarily contamination, but a compromising their water resource, which was fresh water, now becoming more salty and requiring more mechanisms for treatment, etc. Other areas that are vulnerable are those that already experience a higher heat index. So if you look at countries that are more closer towards the equator, these are areas that receive higher solar radiation, are generally warmer parts of the world. So certainly as we accelerate into the future with increased warming, these areas are going to continue to be at the upper edge of experiencing warming and heat. And then I think maybe the third biggest one are areas that are already prone to being water scarce. meaning that they have limited water supplies to begin with for a number of reasons, whether just geographically, geophysically, or even because of consequences of drought brought on by climate change. So there are other types of general characteristics, but the interesting thing to draw between at least these three big categories are all of these are very present in the Middle East and North Africa region, which, just to make the point, as one of the regions that I think that are most climate vulnerable, has a mixture, depending where you look in the region, has a combination of these three characteristics. Beyond the geophysical, I'll just make one note, which I think will maybe lead us more into a discussion later, is countries that have limited capacity and ability to adapt to climate change due to maybe socioeconomic reasons, availability of tools, technology, infrastructure, that is sort of brought on more in an internal aspect versus external reasons that I've just highlighted.
So thank you. Let me just pick up on something that you just mentioned. So coastal areas, the Middle East, North Africa, also Africa, which is, East Africa, for example, currently seeing its worst drought in the last 25 years. But so what I've noticed there is that actually those conditions stretch across whether those countries have money or not. You have countries in East Africa that don't have the money to cope with this, but you also have countries like Bahrain, which is one of the most water stressed countries in the world, possibly better able to cope with it. How important are finances to be able to tackle the challenges being thrown at these countries?
I think finances are a part of the solution to bridge the gap, but finances are important, right? I mean, if you want to incorporate new updates to infrastructure improvements, etc., bring in new climate resilient practices and applications, financing certainly helps allow some of those to come in and be mainstreamed into country if they're not already available in some capacity. But I think beyond financing is also just this idea of capacity that's not just financial based, but capacity for a country to be able to incorporate these levels of technology. I mean, I think that different countries, depending on where they are in terms of climate resilience, have a different capacity to be able to incorporate new technologies and tools. So beyond just the financing, is there things like education, training, to be able to, if we're coming in with financing to implement a high-tech solution, and I don't want to feel like I'm dabbling more into IAT space here, so I don't want to go too far. But if we're financing or investing in different upgrades in terms of technology, infrastructure, et cetera, that's one piece of it. But the other piece is you can build something that is new and cutting edge, but if you don't have the capacity to maintain it as a developing nation, you don't have the expertise to be able to support or work in this type of infrastructure, this type of technology, then you've invested a lot of money for little gain, for little yield in that regard.
Thank you so much, which brings us over to Ayat. Ayat, thank you so much for joining us. So it's not just a matter of money, although, I mean, we have noticed that financing for climate change, particularly for adaptation, is 5 to 10 times less than it needs to be for developing countries. Why are we looking at this huge gap? Because at the end of the day, the world has become significantly smaller, and larger countries must realize, developing countries must realize that just because it's somewhere else does not mean that it is not going to affect them. So big picture, why this lack of coordination or lack of financing?
Very good. Thank you so much, Miret, and it's great to see everybody, and happy International Women's Day today as well. And I actually think that this conversation on climate justice is actually a central conversation also on the issue of gender equality, and I'll come to that. But let's take a look at your broader question, Miret, and how is it that we look globally at how climate impacts, different social, economic, and health outcomes that we see across countries, and some of which Muhammad has shed light on. It's across countries, but also across population groups within countries. That inequity that we are seeing in the way that the impacts manifest themselves, but also in the way that local action is needed, that is very different across, spatially and across income groups, is really a big part of the conversation that we need to have. And for that, I do think that globally the conversation around low carbon transitions and action in the mitigation space has been a lot more advanced, if you want to say, even if the markets haven't, the carbon markets and the financing mechanisms are not there at the level that is needed, but at least the understanding of where the action can happen and what that action will result in. Every GHG emission reduced is reduced for the globe. Whereas when you look at adaptation action and resilience to shocks, that discussion and that distinction between what is in the interest of the people or in the interest of the country itself and what becomes additional because, let's say, it impacts a broader ecosystem, or it impacts livelihoods beyond the borders, or frankly, it was something, as we know, that was not induced by them to begin with, and they are bearing the brunt of the impact at this point, makes that issue of justice much more prominent, but also more difficult to pin down in the realm of adaptation and resilience. So let me just share with you a few of the characteristics from the Africa region side, and just to complement what Muhammad said for the Middle East as well. Look, we see that most the climate shocks are increasing, both in terms of intensity. You cover the Horn of Africa. It is seeing the worst drought in over 40 years, with over 30 million people facing hunger as we speak. We are also seeing that migration, because of climate, is hitting the most vulnerable most. And we had a groundswell report that we published recently that estimated that about 90 million people will be moving from where they live today in the next 20 years or so due to climate-induced impacts. And guess what? Mostly it's the poor, the vulnerable, the rural dwellers that will be packing up and looking for places to find livelihoods. Water stress is a big factor in that case. And even conflict that we are seeing in many parts of the world is because of underlying climate stress and conditions. Then you look at food security more broadly. Even though Africa is exporting food and exporting agricultural products, but it is a net importer. And so when global shocks like the ones we are observing now in terms of food prices and fertilizer prices, guess what? It does hit the poor in our African countries most. And then finally, last but not least, you look at services and you look at the trends in population growth. Of course, this is a fast-growing continent. Many people are moving to urban centers that are becoming more and more fragile, that are not withstanding the shocks of flooding. I was just in DRC a couple of weeks ago, and you look at the impact of flooding in the center of towns, and it's a massive destruction. And of course, the poor find it hardest to withstand. So, and then it's a continent that has the lowest access level in terms of energy, etc. So we can talk about all of these already underlying inequalities that are exacerbated by climate change. And then you ask the question, well, who pays for that? Who pays for the access, closing, let's say, the access gap, but also making that access gap sustainable by in energy or in water supply and sanitation, by making it, let's say, low carbon or more resilient to future shocks. So that is the fundamental question. We work a lot on providing support to vulnerable groups in terms of withstanding climate shocks, in terms of making sure that there is social protection mechanisms that take into account climate shocks. We call them adaptive social protection systems because social safety nets exist. But do they have, for example, embedded in them criteria that take into account when a flood hits or when a drought hits or when farmers are hit vis-a-vis their crops for a season, that allows them to cope or to be more resilient? So those are the questions. There's a lot of work across, but it is important that the global community comes together and defines this a little bit more broadly with these principles embedded in it. And I think that's the conversation that we've been having, of course, including in the COPs, but it is to be continued. Let me stop here, and of course, a lot more to say.
Thank you so much. I'm going to come back to a couple of points that you made because they're important to pick up on. But one point that you made, I'm actually going to turn to Hajar to answer. Hajar's been having technical difficulties, and we're so happy that she's back on board. Hajar, quick question. I had mentioned something. She said it was important to take a look at the interests of the people. So the question is really, who's deciding the interests of the people? And I ask you because you are the former president and co-founder of the Mediterranean Youth Climate Network. And that was because I think a couple of years ago, you said that the voices of young Arabs are not having any impact. So arguably, the Middle East and North Africa region is going to be one of the hardest hit by climate change. And arguably, younger people are going to be affected by it more than anyone else, because this is only going to get worse as it goes along. So do we still think that the voices of younger people are not being heard? And if so, how do we move the conversation along to include people who have the most at stake in this issue?
And thank you, Miret. But too often, youth are left out of the process that shape their futures. And participation is part of the process of the empowerment of young people. Nevertheless, societies often do not view young people as indispensable contributors to policy formulation, evaluation, and implementation. In recent years, some governments have taken significant steps in promoting a place for youth in decision-making. But there is certainly a greater involvement of youth in the home, school, and community. And to have greater involvement will only benefit their socioeconomic environment, but also it will build their own capacities on personal development. So participation of the youth must be seen as a means and an end, and an active and informed participation by young people is not only consistent with, but also demanded by the right-based approach. So therefore, the voice and contributions of the youth are crucial for the effective implementation of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreements, as recognized in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, which reaffirms the intergenerational equity as a guiding principle shaping climate action. And there is an interesting note to say is that for the Paris Agreement to adopt this sentence of the intergenerational equity, it was a hard work of a youth group that was part of the MYTN, which are the Italian climate network, who work strongly towards with the younger group with negotiators to embed the intergenerational equity into the Paris Agreement. That was a huge success of the youth movement worldwide. However, we believe that the voice of young people is not fully heard in policymaking processes in the Arab world, as it is so easy for you to be consulted. It's not very easy for you to be consulted by governments. Despite so much at stake, global governance is in crisis and is failing to respond to the political, economic, social, and environmental breakdown throughout the world, with international institutions unable to act with the speed and urgency and gravity needed. At the same time, we have never heard of so many civil society organizations, mobilized individuals, and campaign movements with the skills, experience, and finance needed to champion, deliver, and evaluate societal change. So there is a real improvement, and there is a lot of work that is being done, and the youth, the Arab youth, are progressing in their knowledge, their knowledge capacity, also in their on acquiring advocacy tools. Sorry. Yes, they seem able to foster transformative innovation through their action and participation in social and policy processes. But nevertheless, there is a long way to address, because we are still in the consultancy framework of this relationship between decision makers and the civil society, and not the participatory approach. So we were muted. So there was no voice, there were no consultations, there was no interactions between decision makers and youth. Then there was an evolution and progression towards hearing each other. So we have a voice, we can be heard, but to what extent these views are taken into consideration into the policy making and their implementation. So here comes the difference between the global and the North, because we need now the North civil society or youth movements are more into if they progress into a more participatory approach. So they are making these policies with their governments.
So let me just ask you about something that you mentioned, and then go back to another thing you mentioned. You said that global governance is in crisis and unable to get its arms around the situation, but we have never had so many civil society groups working on it. Why do we still have this much of a discontent? If we have more people working on this forever than ever, and they are all better financed and better trained and better everything else, why do we still have this inability to make a dent in the governance issue? And then, of course, you mentioned that the difference between Arab youth and global youth, but specifically speaking, I mean, is this related to political situations in the region, or is there perhaps not as much of a tradition of participatory movements in the region, and is there a way of breaking out of that cycle? It's two questions, but related.
Yeah, there is a lot of challenges that the youth are facing. Obstacles, challenges, you may call them whatever, but yeah, there are few things that are getting in the way of these achievements. And let's say that it is a big challenge for the MENA and African youth if the current leaders fail to formulate and implement policies that ensure sustainable developments for both local and continental levels. So through the integration of youth and gender perspective into the policies. But there is another challenge, which is the lack of finance for capacity building. The youth need training in various development activities, of which climate and environmental issues are central. Another challenge is how to integrate climate and environmental issues into the educational curriculum, and most of the educational content that students are learning today is no longer relevant to dealing with current development challenges. Another one, which has to do with the transfer of the indigenous knowledge. Let's say intergenerational cooperation, then the knowledge from the elders to how to deal with climate change issues, with environmental issues. It needs to be integrated with more modern languages, and so these youth can feel more empowered by their communities, from the educational system from one side, and from the indigenous knowledge, or let's say good practices transferred through their generation. Mainly this in the African continent is very present and is very, very important at the communities level. Another challenge is the low social capital, which is of great importance in sharing information and knowledge among this youth. And it helps a lot on this kind of networking for fundraising for the projects, for fundraising also for their right to exist in this, in either in the local or national or international, in all the multilateral processes. So yes, there is the youth. There is another challenge, which is the youth poverty, and which is further worsened by climate change, of course, because most households in let's say MENA and Africa are dependent on agriculture, and any unfavorable occurrences in this sector is directly translated as more poverty, and which would mean limited resources to meet basic needs. And also compounding this problem is the global recession and the emergence of climate change, which has been seen as the reduction in the number of resources allocated to the youth empowerment initiatives, both at national and international levels. So there is differences in access to and use of resources and technologies are a serious challenge to achieve the climate resilience development, and to help on either civil society or let's say civil society led projects or youth movement or whatever vulnerable parts of the communities. However, the youth run the risk of them also contributing to climate change and failing to mitigate it, just as past generations have been doing. In order for the youth to actively and meaningfully participate and influence developments in the direction of climate resilient development, it is important that they understand these issues and the challenges to their achievement. So it's just like a loop. We keep turning on and back to empower their education, capacity building, empowerment, and making them, giving them the means to be present and to talk about their own issues, the issues they are undergoing on their communities. Another one, maybe not the last one, last but not least, which procures a significant difference between the youth civil society in the global north and the Arab world, which first of all comes to the current political situation in many countries, which makes going out full on very difficult. Another challenge is bringing together youth from several countries to discuss and agree on regional subjects using predominantly online tools is very difficult and not very efficient. And this is one of the main hurdles we had on the Mediterranean Youth Climate Network, for example. It was very hard to coordinate all the work being with these online gatherings. So meeting physically for these networks, for this movement, is very important to overcome a lot of challenges and to empower each other. So yeah, we will how we say, nevertheless, in the south, the Arab governments are surprised with Arab youth participation in the worldwide movement against climate change, and some stay prudent and vigilant and towards them. And so that's why we are still working to build a trust relationship with the Arab governments and the Arab negotiators in more generally.
Thank you so much. I know you can keep going for a bit and I can keep asking you, but I'm going to just stop for a second and jump back to Mohammed for a second, because that is one set of challenges. Let me ask you more about the challenges that are more in your bailiwick, the technical ones. What technical challenges are in place? What technical challenges need to be overcome to allow possibly more of an even playing field on tackling climate change? Because I mean, you're going to tell us about how this is done technically, but which countries have access to that kind of knowledge, which don't, and how much of an impediment is, let's say, financing all that technical knowledge?
Yeah, sure. If maybe in answering your question, I'll just take a step back and look at this sort of at a higher level, which is when we talk about, I think, vulnerability to climate, especially for these developing nations, what lens are we looking at, right? You know, because number one, we know, we have an idea which nations we're talking about in terms of vulnerability due to developing access to resource, et cetera. But even those countries within themselves are not homogeneous, right? So vulnerability is assessed differently depending on this. I think it's a point that I had made earlier. There's different segments of society within a country that are vulnerable and experience vulnerability to climate change differently. One of the ways, and so outside of the human dimension, right, like public health, extreme heat, danger, risk, the sort of very first level impact of immediate climate change effects. Another way to look at that vulnerability to begin to assess, okay, what are solutions if they're technical or technological or for infrastructure related, whatever the aspect may be, that's a physical type solution. Where is the vulnerability? And to me, the easy answer is looking at a country's water, food, energy nexus, right? So what is the state of each of those nations' water, food, energy nexus? Is their water resources compromised in terms of availability, in terms of access, in terms of access to clean and adequate water supply? Because that begins to inform you on what kind of solutions you would look towards implementing that could be appropriate, and then you line that up with the capacity of the country to gauge what solutions are good to mitigate or address some of that climate vulnerability. Food side, in terms of both local food production and access to food production. So primarily that's an agricultural issue, and certainly connected to the water issue. I mean, this is a nexus. These all things are connected. And I think maybe for developing, in my opinion, others may disagree, is I think the energy side of the three is probably the least important for a developing nation. And I say that in the sense that, developing poor nations, those that are most impacted by climate change, also tend to contribute the least because they're not usually large carbon emitters. They don't, their energy industry relative to the rest of the world or other parts of the world that have a larger energy footprint is relatively small. So, but the question there is, do they have access to adequate sources of energy to support? There's a lot of, I just realized this is our speakers. This is almost an African panel, actually. Not almost, it is an African panel. So I know all of us are familiar that in our continent, there are still a number of countries to this day that don't have reliable sources of energy. There's still significant times and periods of day where there's energy cuts, water cuts. And so there's certainly a vulnerability in that regard. So going back to your question, if we look at it in the lens of, say, the water, food, energy nexus, a lot of the solutions I think that are appropriate is how do you enhance the reliability of water supplies? So that could be infrastructure projects, right? In terms of a developing ability to expand the viability of existing water resources. So that could be looking at expanding things like water reuse, water recycling. So, it's difficult to augment water supplies if you're a non-coastal community. Certainly if you're coastal, desalination is the easy band-aid. But a lot of times I think for these nations is how do you expand the usage of the existing water supply you have?
So
can I
ask? Yes, I do, because you brought up something really, really important about augmenting water supplies, and maybe actually this is something that AET can contribute to as well. Water doesn't actually do boundaries. Water is a transboundary resource. So how easy or difficult is it going to be to try and get regional cooperation on water issues? Because especially in Africa, we've seen time and time again that regional issues, domestic issues become regional issues. So how do we encourage regional cooperation on resource allocation? And that is, to you and to Ayet, perhaps, she can answer it when you're done, because you'll both be looking at it from different lenses.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. To me, I don't think it's an easy solution, because I'd argue it's more difficult to manage under climate change a water resource, which most are, that are transboundary, versus those that are, constrained within a particular
Sure.
nation. Because what ends up happening, and certainly when we look at major surface transboundary water resources in the region, the big two obviously are the ones that come to mind, whether it's Tigris Euphrates or the Nile.
Yeah.
There's others, of course, smaller, but it ends up under the pressure of climate change, where less water is being generated at the headwaters due to drought, due to less, these are to a certain extent, snowpack driven systems. So they rely on, precipitation happening in higher elevation that then translates into stream flow and so forth. With less supplies being generated, what ends up happening is it becomes a sort of a winners versus losers. And certainly it devolves into an upstream versus downstream nations issue, because those that are closer to the headwaters with the respective dams and reservoirs along each system are able to store and retain more of that water under times of drought, that then propagates, or I guess this case does not propagate downstream in terms of available water supply. So it creates very contentious situations, and it's hard to get to your point. It's hard to get to a scenario, and this is now me completely going out of my field of expertise, of how do you bring those nations together to agree to share a resource that's dwindling, especially when, if you look at upstream versus downstream, an upstream nation has the ability to store more water with little recourse against that. So it's very difficult. It's a very difficult issue. So I'd hate to pass this to you at this very difficult juncture.
Let me actually come in and a little bit disagree with you, Mohammed. I think you painted the right picture, but it is the picture that politicians are taking at the with a short-term view. We have seen that bringing together technical people, sitting them around the table and looking with them at projections of climate over time, there's a lot more convergence of views and a lot more willingness to cooperate at the technical level, because that dwindling resource is for everybody. And as I was mentioning earlier, if it isn't that even if you carry more water or store more water in your headways, the fact that your downstream is going to be impacted more will cause more unrest, more migration, more of the things that, in the medium term, no one wants to see. So I do think actually that that cooperation and the transboundary agenda is one where, if you can get the politicians to see the bigger full picture and to have a conversation that combines the technical and the political, the short and the medium and long term, I think we've seen, and we've done it, for example, for the Mashrek countries, where we've brought all the country technocrats together over a series of conversations on climate impacts and projections. And I think that is extremely important. I don't think we should lose hope or sight. And I do think that over time, it's going to be an imperative. There is just no way around sharing the resource. But let me also reflect on a couple of other things, including on what Hajar said and what you said, Mohammed, around, yes, the African continent produces the least emissions, and it is among the most impacted, and it is getting the lowest amount of climate finance and climate flows. So on the adaptation side, all of what was mentioned and what I also alluded to in terms of the kind of action that is needed, both within boundaries and across boundaries, is imperative. The information around it and knowing and understanding what these impacts are and who stands to lose the most is critical. And in the bank, we are doing climate and development reports for each of the countries, CCDRs. I think we have about 12 now in Africa, or maybe even more, that have been completed. I invite everybody to take a look at them. They tell the story of exactly what is the impact, but also what are some of the opportunities for action in the resilience and adaptation space. But let me just say a couple of things on the also low carbon transition space, because even if these countries are not producing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, much of the low carbon transition is actually in their own interest to do. And now let me take the South Africa example. South Africa produces a lot of, I mean, has a big coal industry, a big coal value chain. A whole region, Mpumalanga, is really dependent on coal fired power plants. So the whole conversation is, should they continue, full steam with that, or should they think about the fact that the global energy market is changing around them, and it's time to catch that train early rather than be left stranded with stranded assets and all what is around them. So they have actually gone through a very, and I want to mention that because it is extremely important, the process, a very consultative process and a just transition framework. And it's part of, I'm bringing it because it is an important component of the climate justice, is that just transition away from coal in a place like South Africa. How do you do it? Who stands to lose? Is it the workers, the small businesses, or the communities at large that are linked to these value chains? And what's the alternative? And how can you bring people into the conversation that they understand what are their opportunities? Obviously, for the workers, it's a lot around compensation, reskilling, etc. But for the communities, what are other options of livelihoods and value chains? And that's a conversation that is difficult, but it has to be had. And I think many of these opportunities in the green value chains, and also I saw a question actually in the chat around green minerals, are extremely important for the countries to own and to adjust to and be ready for, so that they stand to gain as much as possible from global market shift, and that within that gain is equally distributed, or that it reaches also the more vulnerable groups. And it goes back to what Hajar said around human capital. Do we have the people that are skilled in the conversations, that have the information, and that have the capacity to both contribute to the conversation, but also to be beneficiaries of that shift that the market is having? The continent has the biggest youth bulge. We have young people, you can see in countries like Kenya or South Africa or elsewhere, that are really entrepreneurial and along a lot of these transitions and transformations. What we want is for more of these opportunities to reach more young people. You're muted.
You're on mute.
Yes, we just had a couple of technical issues. So actually, I want to be respectful of the fact that we have had questions coming in on the Q&A. So you mentioned the mining and all the rest of it, but are we looking at, I mean, do we think that migration, whether it's urbanization or just migration, do we think that this is a threat caused by climate change, an opportunity caused by climate change? You mentioned that many urban centers were already fragile. As far as I can see, if we continue to have fewer water resources, I can only see greater urbanization and more of a strain on these fragile urban centers. So what resources are available to try and cushion the impact of that slightly? And I'm asking that specifically to Ayet, because I'd like you to maybe explain where multilaterals and the rest of the world come in, so to speak. How do you bridge a gap? Do you have to work on your own for this?
No, I think it takes everybody. I mean, this is a call for action on all fronts. Mm-hmm. Governments have a big responsibility to play, including in poor nations, and I'll mention why. Mm-hmm. Obviously, multilateral institutions and the World Bank are putting, as you know, a large part of our financing is going to climate action. Just last year, we put $19 billion towards climate investments in sub-Saharan Africa. That excludes Northern Africa, which is part of the Middle East region. But it's only a drop in the bucket for what's needed. So that is why also action by countries is important, so that they can create the conducive environment for the private sector to come in and finance the right kinds of investments, the green investments and not the brown investments, right? For the markets to reward the countries for such actions and transformations. And of course, for the global community more at large, and that's the conversation that we're having, to crowd in more climate finance at large. The bank will continue to work. And just to say, to answer your question around, is there benefit from these migrations, or is it only a curse? look, of course, if you cannot absorb these people in the places that they are migrating to, it is a curse. So how can, and one of the things I want to say to that is that the continent is losing natural capital at an alarming speed. And that natural capital, whether it's the forest cover, the ecosystems, the landscapes, the watersheds, if they are not preserved, then more and more people are going to be out of livelihoods, and those are the poorest. So we are, I mean, the bank has large programs in landscape management, in watershed management. I mentioned social protection systems and disaster risk management systems, but we need a lot more of that. And we need it to be embedded in the planning system of the countries, so that the investments and the infrastructure that get built today and tomorrow are actually taking into account that shifting microclimate and regional climate, and that it is adapted to the situation that we foresee over time. And what we're hoping to do, I'll just give an example of a regional program that we're launching hopefully this year, Regional Climate Resilience Program, where we hope that other financiers come in. What we want to do is to build a pipeline of these important investments in water storage across countries. We at the moment have 5 or 6 countries in the Eastern and Southern Africa region participating. But we build a pipeline of these investments. We probably through our financing, because as you know, IDA at the end of the day is still limited. We put a substantial portion of it towards that agenda, but it's still limited. What we want is to build that pipeline of investments in infrastructure, and others can come in and contribute, right? And pick up some of it. Now, I want to end with what the governments need to do. I mentioned that it is conducive environment, but also redirecting their own spending. So governments are spending on many things. It has to be that you have to have that green lens and that resilience lens, very much a focus of your spending mechanism. Are you spending on the right things? Are you rewarding the right behaviors of your market or not? And I think that that is a big part of the agenda, so that everything in terms of domestic resources and international resources pushes in the right direction and not against.
So quick question on that. The bank's obviously doing a lot of heavy lifting, and it's not the bank's job to try and corral governments into spending more. Are you finding that it's a slightly easier conversation to try and convince governments to step up, or is it still a huge struggle?
No, I actually think that governments have the awareness of political, of governments across the continent has. If you ask me personally, I've seen a sea change shift in the way that they see the link between what they are facing, what countries are facing in terms of shocks, what countries also are facing in terms of vulnerabilities to shifts in global markets, and the issue of action at the country level. Of course, there's going to continue to be advocacy, and they should, by African nations around the justice of climate finance, and that more than 3% of global finance needs to flow to the continent. But there is also a recognition that the shocks, of droughts and floods that happen today are linked to longer-term climate patterns, and that requires that they adapt their planning processes, their financing processes at the national level. So I actually think we are engaged in these policy dialogues across most of the countries. As I mentioned, the CCDRs are an excellent platform that allow us to look across sectors around those opportunities and options, because there are trade-offs no matter what. And the politicians recognize it, we recognize it, and the issue is, can we put evidence towards what is a better opportunity and a better course of action today, taking into account not just your short term, but really your medium term. And if you can value that and assess it properly, I think politicians are very much asking us for that and appreciating it quite a lot.
Thank you so much. Hajar, we've got a question here, looks tailor-made for you. How's current programming taking into account grassroots knowledge, and how can we work with that to address climate change? The general question, so perhaps you could direct it to your part of the world.
Yes, actually, the indigenous and community knowledge is now more addressed into the talks and dialogues than a few years before, and there is some work which is done. I will speak for the Moroccan perspective, There
Mhm.
is a project led by UNDP and government and several stakeholders, mainly civil society at local levels, and it seeks to gather this catalog of knowledge, good practices, and community know how to deal with the with climate change issues and impacts, of course, as heat and lack of water, etc. But it is not embedded into the NDCs, unfortunately. That's what we were comparing afterwards. We were
Mhm.
trying to know how, to what extent it is embedded to indices. Unfortunately, not. It is not taken into consideration to indices. Then let's go to more local level, which is the local programming. That's another thing, because we have um, uh, uh, a platform to dialogue with the community, which calls the consultory or advisory boards for civil society, advisory boards for youth, and advisory boards for private sectors. But within these boards, there are few communities that are trying to give their lens into these local policies and programs for the upcoming 5 years. But let me be frank, it is very, very difficult for them to succeed to it. So far, it needs to be framed in more professional way and helped with experts and for professionals, so it can maneuver in a way that could settle on a middle term program with the main benefits declared and assessed afterwards. But let's say, yes, it is very important, that it is very interesting to advocate in that sense, because as a global north, there are lots of these good practices. There are lots of this know-how, even to deal with agriculture. Specifically, it's like a huge treasure. I've been discussing just these 2 days with colleagues from several Arab regions, from Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and Tunisia, for example, and we agree all that there is certain capacities to develop to assess this know-how, community and indigenous know-how to deal with the lands and food, for the food sovereignty and the food security of our communities. And yeah, I will just cannot more agree more than this is a necessity, and it needs to be addressed in a more professional way.
Okay, thank you so much. We've got time for one question, and it's from Mohammed. There was a question on what steps countries in the MENA region were taking for adaptation as opposed to mitigation.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of steps that are being taken or in the process of being taken. I think, to me, that, not to go back to what I said earlier, but I think both on the water side and I think on the water and food security side, this idea of how do you shift to more sustainable irrigation practices. So some of the examples, certainly, maybe not surprisingly, large parts of the Middle East still are using flood irrigation. And other areas in the region are shifting towards drip. There's been new efforts. I'll use an example in Bahrain, where because of their water resource accessibility issues, as well as with the heat, open land agriculture isn't necessarily the most efficient way to go. So there has been a new enterprise over the last few years of shifting to hydroponics. And it's relatively new. There's a fellow over there that's developed, I think it's Peninsula Farms is what it's called, where they're now trying to shift towards having more hydroponic greenhouse farming as a way to mitigate. Of course, it comes with its own issues compared to open field agriculture, but it's an adaptation. And certainly on the other side, looking at water. I think there's areas where there's improvements to water infrastructure in terms of trying to reduce water loss. As well as looking at how do you scale up existing water augmentation. And the one that I think of is expanding water reuse and water recycling. So that, the mechanisms are there. Of course, the impediments, some of the things we talked about, financing, infrastructure, capacity to expand, and so forth. But those are efforts that are undergoing.
Right, thank you so much. We actually have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to use it for a quick question for Ayet. To date, the majority of climate financing is still flowing to developed nations to help with emissions. Do you, I mean, why exactly are developing nations still failing to attract financing, and do you see a way out of this in the future, in the very near future?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer. I will attempt my own personal view, which is that I think that things are changing. As I mentioned, developing the awareness of nations and governments around the importance of the agenda. Just in the past 2 years, between Glasgow and today, and going into UAE COP in a few months, has been really a big shift. I do think that it has to do with their the lack of systems for monitoring, reporting, and verification in these countries, the lack of ready pipeline of investments that can show what these countries can contribute, both in terms of low carbon transitions and low carbon investments, whether it's in the energy field, in the transport field, but also in adaptation and resilience. So I do think it's that. But it's, of course, also, as I mentioned, the advocacy, the conversation at the global level that allows that dynamic to change, with more attention being put to the needs of the more vulnerable nations. And I think that that is happening. We do just need to lock it down with more commitments. I think that the clauses that around loss and damage, the recognition of the developing nations is growing. What we need is probably more concrete mechanisms and quantification of these impacts and results, and which parts of it is global benefit, so that the countries can make the case at the level of concrete investments as well.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists, Ayat Slimane, Hajar Khamlishi, Mohammed Mahmoud, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope to see you again. I'm Miret Mabrouk with the Egypt program at Middle East Institute, and I wish everyone a really great day or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you.